Alrighty. Hey gang, it's Mike from Power BI Tips. We're doing more things with Charticulator. On to episode 6. This time we're going to talk about aggregations with our data using the group by function inside Charticulator. So let's jump right in. With no delay, I'm excited about this one. This one's I think it should be a pretty quick one, but I think the concept here is quite interesting. It's, again, very different than how we're used to working in Power BI Desktop. In episode 5, real quick recap, we worked with the lines, or being able to add curves. I think these are called links in the program, to be able to link different data points between different charts. And now we're moving on to episode 6, where we're going to work on aggregations. Now, everything we've built up into this point has been heavily geared towards grabbing a field, and it's a single data point or a single row by row data field. For this one, we're going to actually add more data to a visual, but we're only going to reveal an aggregated form of that data. So this is actually a pretty interesting feature here, where we're able to produce calculations inside the visual that we can then use. So let's start by, again, building some data. So I'm going to open up my fields window here. I'm going to go after our sample data that we have previously. Start with a table. I'm going to add the index this time, a gender flag, male or female, and then another flag here for V1. So let's take a look at this data. In here we have our index, and the index is basically a row identifier to let us know every single row of data that we have. So for this single data point, we just added an arbitrary index in Power Query to do this. And then for each data point, which is the V1, that's your variable or whatever the value is, V1, every single data point we have, those are different data points or things that we've collected informationally wise. Now we have the gender flag, and this is what we're going to use as our dimension property inside the visual. So the next thing we're going to do is let's show you how we would aggregate this inside Power BI Desktop first. So I'm going to build another table really quick. And what we're going to do here, instead of having the index on the list, we're actually going to grab just the gender this time, male, female, or other. And then we're going to add our variable 1 to this list. And by default, Power BI produces an implied measure. So this is an implicit measure that's applied here. The V1 is that implied measure. And how do we know this is an implied measure? We know this is an implied measure by clicking the down arrow and seeing that this has a sum applied to it. And so we can also click on the column itself. And when we go over to the column tools, we'll also see it has a default summarization of sum, meaning when I grab this field and bring it to the table or the canvas, anywhere on the canvas, no matter what I do, it'll always do default to sum as the aggregation first. Well, in this case, we don't really mind, but we're actually going to change this default calculation method. So this is not going to be an implied measure. We're actually going to change it to average. So it's now implied the average of V1. And then we'll also add it again for the minimum. So in the grouping of all the data points that are female, we're going to find the minimum value of all those data points. So now if I click it again and say minimum, it now produces just kidding, I did it on the wrong column. Let's go back to average for column 1. Column 2 will be our minimum. And so now it looks through all the data points that we have, and of all the data points we have, we get the minimum item here. And then lastly, we can do the same thing again, add V1 again to our data table, click the down arrow, and then go to the maximum. So this is the highest value that we see. Interesting point here, the other category has the same average, the same min, and the same max. We can quickly test this because when I add another line here and say count, there's only one record. So that would make sense. The average, the minimum, and the maximum would also be the same value when you only have one data point. Okay, good enough for what we're looking to do here. Let's get rid of that last data point. So what we will supply to Charticulator, though, is these 3 columns, index, gender, and V1. And I think I've got my zoom it in here. Let's just make sure we have it. Yes, we do have it. These are the 3 columns we're going to supply, index, gender, and V1. So in typical fashion, I will move my data tables to the left-hand side here so we can work in Charticulator. Oops, get out of the way. Move this guy over here. Okay, Control C, Control V. That's the easiest way to get a visual built. I have the new visual, and then I'm going to go into Charticulator. Check out episode 1 if you want to see how to add this custom visual into your Power BI programs. Once we have the data here, let's rearrange this. So we're going to go index, gender, and then V1 for all the options. And now we will go hit the ellipsis, and then we will hit edit on the Charticulator app. This will then bring it into the edit mode. Next, we will go to create a chart. And we're in the chart area. So we've talked a lot about the bar at the top of the page here. We've gone through links, we've gone through guides, plot segments, scaffolds, and marks. So we've pretty much covered all of the features at the top here. This is more around this feature here that we're talking about now, about this aggregation, is now we're adding the ability to add math or in visual calculations to something that we're doing here. So the first thing we look at here, we look on the plot area. If I click the plot area, you'll notice we've had plot segment number 1 selected. So this is our plot area. And what we're going to do is I am going to click on the plot segment and we're going to group by. So we're going to tell Charticulator what are the defined groups I want this plot segment to behave like. So I'll say group by, and then we're going to pick the only dimensional column that we have, which is gender. And when I group by gender, you'll see that my glyph gets much larger. It's more square looking at this point. So if I undo that, if I go back to none, you'll notice that the glyph is really, really small and like this really thin line. That's because we have about 300 data points that we're looking at when we do this data point. So, every single row is what Charticulator is looking at to do some sort of math or visualization with that data point. So it's going row by row to do the visualization. In this case, if we use the index plus the gender, that is then giving us every single data point, all 350 data points in one chart. That means there are 350 slices of glyphs or glyphs that we can draw on this chart. So if I click on the group by again, go back to gender, we know now that this was in our previous table that we saw, and this is why I like starting with tables, we actually had only 3 data points. There were just 3 data points that we were looking at, male, female, and other. So because of this now, we now can see the glyph is much larger and easier to work with. All right, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to change the stacking. So typically the stacking of a standard bar chart stacks at the X, and this is up here in the upper left-hand side. We're not going to stack by the X, we're going to stack on the Y axis. So clicking this button, we'll say stack on the Y, and this will change the orientation of our glyphs from being vertical bars to now being horizontal bars. Now that we've got this, we can start building. Now this time, I'm not going to start with a square or any kind of objects or shapes. We're actually just going to build everything with a line and possibly a circle here. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to pop out the glyph because I'm going to focus my attention on the glyph and I want this to be nice and big so it's easy to work on. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build a scale on top of this. So I'm going to grab the scale, the data scale, start here at the left and go all the way up to the right. So this is a measurement axis. I'll put data on this axis and data points will appear on this axis. Grabbing V1, my variables, my numbers, grab that and drag it over to the data axis. And we can see way over here, it's kind of hard to see, but we can see there's a data point that has been added called average on V1. Now what it's doing is we're auto-applying some sort of aggregation because we can't graph every data point in a glyph. The glyph needs a single data point. The chart area, we've already said, needs to be grouping things by the gender. And of that single gender glyph, so you can think of there's going to be 3 different glyphs, one for each gender. The one we have now is the average of all the data points that belong to the specific gender. Okay, so escape on this. So we have a single data point. Now, when I added that, you'll also notice down here, if I highlight the data axis and then go down to the bottom, you'll see there's a data expression. This is where that average function was added and put on to the chart, that data axis for ourselves. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add calculations. So this is doing an average of all the data points. We also want a min and a max like we had previously shown in our other data chart. So I'm going to grab the V1 item again, my variable, my number, drop it again to the axis. I'll make another average on there and a third time as well. And if you zoom in again, now I have 3 data points, but they're all saying average. They're all the same items over and over again. So if we want to adjust this, I already know there's functions. So per the documentation on Charticulator, this is following the expressions and expression formatting that comes out of d3.js. I don't think every single function's covered, but I do know average, min, and max, and the standard deviation function, which is denoted as stdvdev. Those are 4 functions that I have found that seem to work here. I don't know where the documentation is on this one. I haven't found very much here, but I do know that those 4 functions are for sure covered. So if I go over here to the average, let's make the first one minimum. So I'm just going to type in the word min and zoom in on that. So this is going to be, I'm just going to the front of that data expression and typing the word min. We'll go average next, and then the final one we'll do will be max, M-A-X. And if I zoom back out here on the data chart, you'll see here on the chart, we only have average V1. So where did those other data points go? Well, the data scale axis is automatically picking stuff for us. So if I adjust this, hopefully, go down to 0 here. When I force the data axis to go to 0, meaning start at the very beginning, it auto scales the axis out so we can see the other data points. And you can see way, way, way over here, my max data point has been added to the chart. So it's auto scaling, but only to so far. So I'm going to just, again, because I know my data fairly well, I'm going to just drop in 80 on the upper end. No, I won't. I'll go higher, 90. Let's go 100. Okay. So now I've got a range on a data axis that goes from 0 to 100. And now I can see all my 3 data points, the min, the average, and then the maximum. So this is defining lengths of information about the group of items that are applying to this glyph. So this one glyph applies to many data points. Hope I'm making myself clear there. If you have any questions about this, the chat is open, so feel free to ask questions, and I'll try and answer them on the fly and kind of semi-monitor that for you as well. All right, let's draw some lines on this chart so we can see what's going on with the data points here. So I'm going to go up to the marks area and the top of the ribbon here, marks, and grab the line. When we grab the line, we'll start at the minimum and we'll draw from the bottom all the way to the top. So all I did was draw from the bottom anchor all the way up to the top area. And that then anchored the bottom and top bars for me. So the green dots mean we are correctly anchored and it will move properly. We're going to do the same thing on the top end. Go over here to max, drag that up and produce that as well. And there we go. Now we have our maximum value additionally. And then what we can do now is let's draw a line between them to kind of show like a barbell or some kind of scale that's going on here. So all I'm doing is drawing from the very midpoint of the minimum line and going all the way to the end on the maximum line. Okay, now that we've got this part, we can add another data point. So for this next data point, we're now going to address going after the average. What is the average data point? So next I'll go over to the shapes area, or the symbol. I'll click on symbol, and we will line this up so that the orange line, so it's giving me guides here. So this is the midpoint of that line, which is what we don't want. We actually want it to align with the average, but then put the data point here on this middle area of the glyph. So clicking there, there's my data point. And to add some flair to this, because that sucker is super small, we're actually going to add, let me minimize these to make this a bit bigger for everyone to see. We're actually going to add the size of the dot. So the size of the circle, we're going to make it the same size as what the average of the V1 is doing. So this is showing you the size of that dot and its average. Now that we have this, we've got pretty much the chart here, and it kind of looks like a TIE fighter. So for those of you who like Star Wars, this is something that may be kind of fun. This is maybe the Star Wars chart or the TIE fighter chart. So we're on the data axis. We're showing the minimum and maximum range. We're able to show what the minimum value is, what the maximum value is, and then where the middle dot is for the average data point. So we can kind of see if this data is looking like it's skewed or not. In the statistics world, this is where you would see if the average is way, way, way low on the lower end. I think you're skewed to the right. And then if your data point's way, way high on the other end, you might be skewed to the left. And that's kind of how you would potentially look at the distribution of data within a given area. All right, so I think we're good here. Let's just do a little bit more on the colors to make sure that we can distinguish between what is happening in the different categories here. So we will go over to the gender item. And so we'll bring gender, and for then each of these items, line 1, 2, 3, and then the symbol, let's stylize them. So I will bring the gender down to the fill, and that will then change the circle to be a specific color based on the color palette that Power BI has chosen. And then for line 3, we'll do the same thing. I'm going to add the gender there. And I do want to do something here. So line 3 is the one that's going to cross like from the horizontal distance here. So I may want to beat this up a bit so I can see the line a little bit thicker. So I'm going to turn it up to a 5. But because this is going to kind of conflict with the dot, because I want the dot to be front and center, right? That the dot's important to me. So what I'll do is I will make the opacity of the bar like 0.4. And so what that will do is that'll make the bar across much lighter than the dot that we're putting on the bar. So it kind of accentuates the dot and not so much about the bar and the dot as a combination. We may make it fade there a little bit. And we could probably even go a little bit more aggressive. Maybe we could go 0.3 as well to really fade out that line. Then next we're going to go to the line number 2. Same thing, add the gender to that, put it in the stroke, change the line width to 5 again. And this time I'm going to leave this bar in its solid opacity of 1 because this is now marking the beginning and the ends, and I want this to kind of stick out. Line 1, same thing. We're going to add the gender to the stroke, line width of 5. And now we've got the ends of the bar. So now we're able to place all the data points on the same line. So we've got a couple hundred data points here, and they're all making sense based on this, this aggregation together. The only thing I can think of here that would be left is the data axis that we have on here is kind of funny because the numbers are actually in the way of the arms of our visualization. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the data axis and we're going to make the position the opposite and flip those underneath. So it's away from the glyph. It's on the outside of the glyph. And with that, I think we've drawn our glyph. So I'm going to pop this back in here, and there we go. Now we have our 3 different segments, and then we have a data axis across the bottom to give you the different distributions, and you can see the variance between each one of them. You can now see the min and the max, and then the heights of each one. There's a couple different ways we can add a legend on here. I'm going to go up here to the upper left-hand corner. We can click legend, and we can do legend on gender. And so there's my gender, the legend based on gender. And we may want to centralize that or kind of put it in a area up here on the upper left-hand corner. So in order to do this correctly, I will use some guides to help me define what that is going to look like. So I'm going to grab the X guide. So the guide along the X axis, I'm going to make a little guide here. That'll give me vertical lines that go up and down. And then again, I'll make another Y line guide. So this will go across the Y axis, and that gives me more grids. So this basically, all this is doing is building an equalized grid for me that I can then drag that. Oops, I just grabbed the whole chart. That's not what I wanted. I wanted to grab this one over here to that corner, and I want the chart to come out. Of course, it's not going to let me do this in a very elegant way. There we go. Okay, so then now what I'm doing is I'm bringing the legend, and I can pull the legend in a little bit. And if I don't like the spacing that I have, we can always modify the guide coordinators to be a higher number. So if I go 5 or 6, I'm actually increasing the divisions in that area. And then I can, what that is doing then is actually automatically moving my legend kind of further up to the left-hand corner. So now I have this kind of matched out grid here that I can then apply. And that way I do this so that way when I am adjusting the entire graph as a whole, that position will always be locked in place. I always know that that will be there in that one particular area. So now if we click on the plot area, and for the plot area, let's just, I think we can have this issue again with the data axis on the bottom here. Let's just try to get away with 40 on each of them. We'll see how that looks. Probably could do 30 again. I think that's what I did last time. Okay, 30 on everything. That looks good. So there we go. We've got our TIE fighters. We've got our averages in the middle there. And we can see our single one data point where the minimum, maximum, and the average is all in the same area. The only other thing we may want to do on this one, and we don't have to, we have the legend that describes what's going on. And I think I can actually change the size here too. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Size 20. And I wonder, I saw someone in the comments mention that I can change the font to Segoy UI. So I'm going to type it in. It looks like it did it. Okay. So interesting thing that was before, when we looked in this list here, Segoy is not in this list. You can't, it's not in the list here. But apparently a trick or a hack is, because Power BI acknowledges that Segoy UI is available, you can just type it out, Segoy space UI, and just, I'll zoom in there real quick. Segoy space UI, you can just type it out, and that way this will match with what's happening inside the rest of Power BI Desktop. I like that feature. All right. And with that, we've drawn our TIE Fighter chart, and we've aggregated all the data points for each of these sections and made them a single data bar or a single glyph for many different actions. This is something that you can't do in desktop very well. You can't build a visual and calculate portions of calculations inside the visual. This is the only visual that I'm aware of that you can do this. That there may be other custom visuals, and I'm not sure about all of them, but inside desktop, this is a really neat way of being able to embed additional mathematical calculations inside the visual as opposed to having to do everything with a measure. All right, let's save this. Let's go back to the report. And there we go. We have our chart. Now, I guess I'll call this one the TIE Fighter chart. That's it. Short, sweet, and easy today. Nothing that really got me hung up too bad. And with that, I think we can give episode 6 a wrap. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for just showing up and hanging out with me while we build some more Charticulator. I'll see what I can come up with tomorrow. I think I'm running out of examples for how to use the program. I think we've covered pretty much the basics. The only thing I can think of left is maybe a bit more on the links and how to link and make like a chord chart. So I think my next actions, or what I'd like to do next, would be to start building some of the charts that come from Power BI, or sorry, I'd like to build some of the charts that come from Charticulator.com, the examples they have. So I'm going to probably start going through the examples there. If there's any examples that you want to see first, make sure you make a comment down in the comments below. If you like this content and you want more of it, please make sure that you like and subscribe. And from there, I'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.